Hello, I'm John, one of the High Rock pastors, and I'm honored to continue our series on prayer, a series called No Words. Sometimes we struggle to know the right words to pray, and sometimes there literally are no words that could truly express what's inside of us. Last week, Pastor Willie talked about how some of the most powerful prayers are little more than groans. How's that for no words? Well, today I'd like to continue that trend of going beyond words. Instead of giving you words that you might pray, I want to talk about how to pray with our whole bodies in a way that goes beyond words. But before I do that, I have to offer a confession. I'm really bad at praying. Yes, the person teaching about prayer today just said that he's really bad at prayer. But some of you are thinking, don't worry, PJ, your prayers sound just fine. I mean, sure, your prayers are not as eloquent as Pastor Adele's or as heartfelt as Pastor Rob's, but your prayers aren't terrible. Well, first, I thank you for your concern. Second, I'm not talking about how my prayers sound. My problem with prayer runs deeper. When I say that I'm bad at praying, what I really mean is I'm bad at bothering to even pray at all. You see, when I face a problem, I usually would rather just do something, even if it's not the right thing, or learn something, or figure out a solution. Praying is often my last option rather than my first. Praying is often what I do after I've tried everything else. When I start my day, it's easier to look at my phone rather than my Bible. When I think about what's next, it's easier to look at my calendar rather than look to God to remember what my priorities might be for that day. But I know that I'm supposed to pray, so I do it. But it's often a matter of doing it just to get it done, and sometimes I'm tempted to forget to pray at all. I want what I see in so many of you, a vital, heartfelt engagement with God in prayer. It's what I see in Jesus and what I see in Nehemiah in today's passage. And in my worst moments, my struggle with prayer leads me to doubt my connection with God. Do you struggle with prayer? Do you find it difficult to engage with God throughout the day? Do you ever feel that your prayers lack power or conviction? Kids, grown-ups too, do you struggle to remember to pray at all? I've shared with you some of my struggles. Now I want to give you a chance to share some of the challenges that you have with prayer. We'll have a few questions for you to discuss with one another or in the live text chat. While today's message is for everyone, I hope that it will be helpful, especially to those who struggle with prayer like I do. Now, earlier I said that I wanted to talk about how to pray with our whole bodies in a way that goes beyond words. Nehemiah's prayer is a great example of praying in this way. The setting was a time of national struggle and tragedy. It was not unlike the moment of national crisis that many of us feel today. It was a time of exile. The Jewish people had been taken away from their homeland and brought into captivity for decades. But a new king had come along who was allowing the Jewish people to start returning to the land of Israel. But it wasn't going well. Their capital city was in ruins, and without strong gates and walls, they couldn't protect themselves from constant attack. They were disgraced and demoralized. And God was being mocked. After all, why would anyone honor a God who couldn't protect the people? Nehemiah loved God above all else, and he loved his own people as well. So his heart was broken to hear this news, much like how our hearts are so often broken when we hear the news lately. So Nehemiah reacted in the same way that many of us have. He broke down and wept. He grieved. He lamented. He fasted and prayed to God. And his prayer is a great example of how to pray. He started by praising God, a faithful and loving God. Nehemiah then confessed his own failings and his family's failings and his nation's failings as if they were his own. He didn't blame others. There was no us versus them, no left versus right. Nehemiah stood in solidarity with his whole nation and confessed their sins as his own. There's a whole sermon right there. After praise and confession, Nehemiah started calling on God's promises. This whole prayer is rooted in those promises. How well do we know God's promises that we might call on them? There's another whole sermon right there. And finally, he made his actual request. It all boiled down to a single ask. Nehemiah was willing to take a risk, willing to take a step of faith, to put his career and even his life on the line by asking the king for a favor to execute a bold plan. Nehemiah has all the right words. And if you want to learn the words that go into a good prayer, this is a great prayer to study. But for today, I want us to go beyond the words. Rather than focus on what he prayed, let's look at how he prayed. Nehemiah says, "When I heard these things, I sat down and wept. For some days I mourned and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven." This prayer wasn't a one-time prayer. It's actually the culmination, a summary of months of praying, the culmination of a whole entire process of praying. And it's a prayer that is embedded in the physical act of fasting. Of all the considerations that people give to prayer, I think that fasting is one of the most neglected. Even for those who pray regularly, fasting is relatively rare and often misunderstood. But for me, and I believe for many of us, fasting might be the missing piece that robs our prayers of real power. Now, in the Bible, fasting shows up all over the place as a preparation for receiving a word or a blessing from God. When Moses went up to the mountain to receive the words of God, he fasted. Before sending out Paul and Barnabas to be missionaries, the early church fasted and prayed. Fasting also shows up frequently in the Bible as a way to open up one's heart to God in a moment of grief. When Saul and Jonathan were killed, the people fasted for 7 days. When Haman issued the edict to kill all of the Jewish people, the people grieved with fasting and prayer. Are you interested in receiving a word from God or a blessing? Are you seeking to open your heart to God in a moment of grief? Then fasting is a well-attested way to prepare yourself to receive what God has for you. Notably, Jesus began his entire ministry and prepared to face his greatest temptations by engaging in fasting and prayer. And Jesus expected that we might follow his example. However, Jesus knew that fasting was also dangerous. Like all outward expressions of spirituality, fasting could become a form of spiritual showmanship and hypocrisy. Some people have used this warning as an excuse to avoid fasting at all. I remember one pastor who used to joke, "I used to fast and pray, but now I feast and believe." But Jesus still seemed to expect that we would fast. Jesus didn't say if you fast, but when you do. The Bible seems clear, and Jesus seems clear, that fasting should be a regular part of how we pray. I would love to get into a more extended discussion of the reasons we often do not practice fasting, but I'll save that for the Zoom discussion that follows the service. Instead, I want to share how fasting became the missing piece that transformed my own prayer life. There was a moment in my life when I was desperately wanting God to speak into my life. I didn't know what to do. I had explored law, I had explored medicine, I had considered a career in law enforcement, and I wondered whether God had called me into ministry. I needed to know what God wanted me to do with my life, and I just didn't know which way to go. And so, for the first time in my life, I voluntarily decided to fast and pray. I did something that some people call a Daniel fast, named after the Daniel in the Bible who fasted by avoiding all the rich foods and wine given to them and instead ate vegetables. I decided that I would eat just plain foods. For the most part, I ate rice and beans and drank milk and water. No added salt, no sugar, and no seasonings. Basically, no foods with interesting flavors or textures. And I decided that I would fast and pray this way until I received my answer from God, however long that might take. That fast turned out to be far more difficult than I had imagined. At the time, I was almost finished putting myself through school by working as a waiter at an Italian restaurant. The owner loved me. I had been there since the restaurant opened, I never missed a shift, and I was old enough to sell wine. The restaurant owner kept me well-fed and happy. Saying goodbye to all that delicious food was hard. What was especially challenging was the unlimited garlic bread. Every time I opened up that warmer in the kitchen, the sweet, sweet smell of garlic butter would hit me right in the face. And with free refills on bread, it was torture. But here's the thing. The point of fasting isn't to suffer. And it's not trying to be super spiritual so God will have to take notice. That's not the point at all. The point is to break up the ordinary rhythm of life and create a special time when we can continually connect to God in prayer. In fasting, every time you feel the urge to satisfy your hunger, that's a reminder to pray. And every 5-hour evening shift at the restaurant became a 5-hour prayer session. My whole body became engaged in prayer. I like to think that my prayers carried the aroma of garlic bread up to God. I believe that fast lasted about a month. And something interesting happened along the way. Rather than focusing on my own hunger, I started to notice spiritual opportunities around me. I started to have deeper conversations with other restaurant workers. I remember 2 conversations that were life-changing for them and for me. I began to experience what theologian Scott McKnight writes about in his book about fasting. The first line of his book says, "Fasting is a person's whole body natural response to life's sacred moments." And the last line of the book says that fasting is a matter of being with God and on God's side in the midst of these moments. In other words, fasting is less about getting God to do things for us and more about aligning ourselves fully with what God is already doing in the world. By fasting, we step out of the normal rhythms in such a radical way that we are free to find a new rhythm that's more in sync with God. I had started my fast by wanting an answer from God. What should I do with my life? I was going to wrestle that answer from God. But along the way, I became more open, and I began to notice how God was moving in people around me, and I had this spiritual newfound sensitivity to step into those moments to help people see where God was working in their lives. And in the end, that experience was my answer. It's why I'm here talking with you today. In Nehemiah's prayer, perhaps it was fasting that opened him up to confessing not only his own failures, but owning the collective failures of his family and his nation. And perhaps it was fasting that opened him up to offering his own life as an answer to his prayer at significant risk and personal cost. I've heard it suggested that when Jesus fasted, he faced the devil's temptations not at his weakest, but at his strongest. Fasting spiritually prepared him for the challenge. In a few minutes, I'm going to suggest ways to fast that involve things other than food, like fasting from technology or social media or shopping. In fact, I think fasting from food is spiritually tricky and definitely not recommended for kids. But before we get into those issues, I'll repeat what I asked you earlier. Are you interested in receiving a word from God or a blessing? Are you seeking to open your heart to God in a moment of grief? Could fasting, whether from food or something else, be a way to prepare yourself to receive what God has for you? Take a moment to discuss that question with those around you or in the chat. As I've shared, fasting was a huge missing piece of prayer for me. I went from someone who had trouble praying at all to someone who couldn't stop praying, especially around garlic bread. In the time I have left, I want to offer some suggestions on how to fast and to make a request. First, fasting doesn't have to be about food. In fact, I suggest that you at least consider something other than food. Like Lynn Babb says in her book about fasting, fasting from all food draws me into a diet place rather than a God place. I echo her thoughts. We want fasting to bring us to a quiet place, not a diet place. But even more than that, we don't have the same relationship with food that ancient people had. Food is often no longer the primary way we experience our daily needs. Today we often feast on many things other than food. Online games, entertainment, shopping, endless scrolling, and seeking likes and retweets on social media, or just seeking approval and appreciation from those around you. What is it that you regularly feast upon? What makes you feel empty if you don't have it? It might be food, but it might be something else. The emptiness we experience when we stop feasting can be the opportunity to experience greater fullness in Christ. So that's my first suggestion, that fasting can and perhaps should focus on something other than food. Second, fasting is best when it creates a connection to community. One way fasting can create a connection to community is by opening you up to the needs of others rather than just your own. Nehemiah's praying fast was filled with concern for others. My own fast opened my eyes and my heart to what God was doing in others around me. Fasting can and should be an opportunity to temporarily take focus away from your own needs so that you can focus on the needs of others. We sang Break Every Chain earlier, and Pastor Sharkey mentioned Isaiah chapter 58, which was a prophetic warning about fasting or any form of spirituality that ignores the needs of others. True fasting, says God, is not just to humble ourselves for our own sakes. Instead, true fasting and prayer should turn us to bring freedom and justice to the oppressed, to share food with the hungry, and to give shelter to the homeless. Jesus warned us not to fast in such a way that we draw the attention of others while we focus on ourselves. Instead, we are to fast in a way that focuses on God and others while not drawing attention to ourselves. Another way to fast that creates connection to community is by doing it together. There are regular times when we encourage one another to fast, like the season of Lent that leads up to Easter. But given the topic today, and given this unprecedented time of quarantine and political turmoil and looming presidential election and continuing strife over racial injustice and violence, I'm asking that you consider fasting this week. Maybe it's something you do as a small group or as families, to give up something that you feel you need in order to open yourself up to God and to others. Maybe you could give up that $3 morning coffee and use that money to bless your local food bank. Maybe you could give up that social media feast and use that time to actually call someone to see how they're doing and then to pray for them. I could offer many suggestions, but instead, I'll encourage you to read Isaiah 58 for yourself. Perhaps it could be something you read each day as you prayerfully consider how God might have you respond. At the end of his 3 months of fasting and praying, Nehemiah was so open to God that he was willing to be the answer to his own prayers, asking for success with a king who could just as easily end his life. Would you be willing to join with me in fasting this week? Finally, one caveat about fasting, again related to community. Even when fasting privately, I think it's a good idea to not let your fasting interfere with community. I remember being on a fast when someone invited me to dinner. Remember those days? Well, when they invited me out to dinner, I broke my fast in order to be with them, never mentioning that I was fasting. In fact, breaking my fast allowed me to enjoy my time with them even more. I read one woman who shared how in her own local church, the whole church fasted from meat during Lent. At a potluck after Sunday service, one of the visitors brought in a huge pile of homemade fried chicken. Everyone was in shock. They couldn't eat meat. And now this outsider brought in a whole platter of forbidden food. But the pastor immediately walked up to the visitor, helped himself to a thigh, and thanked the young man for participating in such a meaningful way. Fasting may start us with seeking an answer to heartfelt personal prayer. But in the end, the destination is always a greater love for Christ and for our sisters and brothers. Amen.